Major news outlets today are reporting that inflation is below the Bank of England's target of 2%. First of all, this is great news. I'm not here to be negative. But I do also think that we deserve the full picture. And the focus on this rate of inflation, CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is only really part of the story. I'd like to give you the whole picture today that I think is reflective of your day-to-day spending. CPIH is the preferred measure of inflation from the ONS, the body that compiles the inflation figures. It's the one they quote on the homepage right here. Now, to be fair, the Bank of England's 2% target is on CPI. But from my view, speaking to you as someone who is currently sat in a house while it's absolutely tipping it down outside, I'm going to say that I think that this place, this house, is a pretty important contributor to the total cost of my day-to-day life. And the H in CPIH stands for housing costs. As you can see, this CPIH number sits at 2.6%. So let's first of all take a look at the underlying figures to see what is going on using this table, which is the main categories within the CPIH data. We've seen big falls in alcohol and tobacco, even though the numbers there remain very high. But please remember, any positive inflation figure here is a growth on top of previous rates. We would need to see negative numbers to be seeing declines in prices. We do have some examples of those. The most notable here is transport, which is the biggest downwards force on the overall inflation number, airfares being a big factor here. Okay, broken record time. Every time we talk about inflation numbers, I encourage us to focus on the core and the service numbers. So just to remind you, core inflation is the data after you strip out food, energy, alcohol and tobacco. These items tend to be more volatile items and they're often influenced by external factors. If you remove these, you get a picture of the underlying or core inflation in the UK. That has declined from 4.3% to 4%. Again, it's nice to see a decline, but when you then process that many of the things we buy daily are still going up at 4% on top of previous growth, you see the 1.7 figure of CPI just seems a bit off. It's even worse if we look at services. We're a service-based economy, we consume and work in service-based jobs in the main, and the inflation here is still very elevated at 5.6%, down from 5.9. There can be a big lag in this type of inflation, and I am reassured by the fact that it is starting to decline. The Bank of England use wage growth as a guide on when they think that they'll see service-based inflation fall, because basically they argue that wages are the main cost to service-based businesses, and if we're seeing high or growing wage growth, that can be a signal of high service-based inflation to come, as companies will just increase the cost of their services to compensate for paying people more. Wage growth has started to decline and the Bank of England will take this as a good sign. From your perspective though as an employee, your ability to negotiate pay rises is now falling. If you've not had a pay rise in the last 12 months, please consider asking for one. Or just take a look around in your industry to see what other people in a similar position are being paid, look at Glassdoor or whatever. This isn't you demanding more money, it's simply you asking to maintain the same level of purchasing power from your employment as you did before all of this mess started happening. In a moment, what I'll do is I'll give you some tools to work out what sort of pay rise you would need to maintain that purchasing power, so you've got a little bit of ammunition going into those conversations. Okay, so the biggest thing on this table that sticks out like a sore thumb, and the main reason I focus on CPIH data, is housing costs. We have housing and household services, of which owner-occupier housing costs. The main component of owner-occupier housing costs is the interest people pay on their mortgages. A large portion of the UK population, around 1/3 of homeowners, own outright, so they're immune to the impacts of rising mortgage rates. But for anyone who owns on a mortgage that has been forced to refinance at higher rates, or anyone who rents, they felt these increased housing costs. We can see that growing impact on this table, highlighted by the red and yellow bands. It's even clearer here. We have CPIH and CPI headline rates declining as the purple of housing costs marches upwards. This is really the sick joke that the answer to inflation is to increase the cost of borrowing so individuals have less to spend, is now one of the main drivers of inflation. I think this is why the Bank of England's target is on CPI and they ignore the housing component, because it's pretty awkward combo, isn't it, to be like, yeah, well, you know, we're punishing you over here to fix things over there. The relief to housing costs will come from further interest rate cuts. I suspect there will be pressure now on the bank to cut rates on the 7th of November. I think they will. I think they'll be reassured by the fact that we've seen service numbers come down a bit and also the wage data. But I think there'll still be like a cautious tone around the core numbers, which have and remain to be very sticky. There's also this chance that we see the rate of inflation go back up a bit again. This is the monetary policy report from the Bank of England and they release these every 3 months or so. And within it, they make a forecast on where they think inflation will go. You can see that they forecast a rise in the coming months, and they say it right here. We expect inflation to rise again before settling back down. If we look at the month-on-month data, we can see why this might happen. So this is 13 months of data, and think of it like a conveyor belt. This pretty high month here of September has fallen off the calculation and been replaced by this lower month here, this year's September. October and then November last year were both low or negative contributing months to the annual inflation number. So any spike in the next 2 months, even a small one, would see the overall headline rate rise again. It's this cluster here in the middle of higher months that need to move out of the calculation that are likely why the bank is forecasting a rise then a fall again in 2025. I think a 10-year view of the monthly figures gives us a much better picture of the long-term trend. You can see the period of high inflation between 2021 and 2023. And now we're in what looks like a more normal range. It's odd really to stare at this graph and just to compute the havoc that these lines represent to everybody's lives in the UK. I want to go in a slightly different direction now with this, because whenever we cover the inflation numbers, I tend to focus on the current headline rate, the core numbers, and then future forecasts. But we've had these elevated rates of inflation now for a few years, and the cumulative effect of those price rises, the price increases all added together, has done lasting damage to the cost of everyday goods and services that we buy. This chart shows what I mean. The orange line is the yearly headline rate that we've all tracked. It rose and then it's come back down again. But the blue line is the impact on prices, the cumulative effect of those increases over the same time period. When you hear that inflation is 10%, 5%, or it's at our target of 2%, it can get a bit hard to step back and go, okay, but how much has everything actually increased in price? Members of my team from Financial Interest, which is the newsletter and website that I run, put together a breakdown of the total change in cost of many of the day-to-day items that we all buy. If you want emails like this sending to you, you can sign up to the newsletter below. I've also pulled together some research and tools that will show the extent of inflation and help you work out what your personal rate of inflation is. My aim here is not to depress you. I know that these figures can get a bit heavy sometimes. What I want to do is empower you with the information so you can critically assess what the government is saying to you and say, is that reflective of what's going on in my life? But most importantly, I just want to validate your feelings, because if you're anything like me, every time I walk into a supermarket and buy something, I think, 2% inflation, what's going on? Things are certainly not back to normal. And I just want to show you why what we're being told and what we feel on the ground are very different things. Let me go through some of the financial interest data first of all, and then we'll look at some of the individual rates of inflation and how to calculate it. So the data we compiled looked at everyday items that we're all exposed to and the worst offenders in those categories. Food inflation as an overall category peaked at 19.1% in March 2023. This list of items looks between 2019 and June 2024 when we compiled the data, but only includes items that have risen by more than 45% in price over that period. Olive oil is by far the worst offender, with an increase in price of 135.77%. The consecutive droughts in Spain, which produces around 40% of the world's olives, is to blame for that. The price of olive oil is expected to decline again. But the list goes on. White sugar, 70%, baked beans, 67%, still mineral water, 64%, even chicken Kievs weren't safe, up 51%. We looked at the cheap chicken Kievs, which are a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. In fact, nothing guilty about it, I love them. But anyway, seeing the price, I was like, a cheap Kiev is 60% air in the middle. So it's pretty outrageous that the price can increase like that. We'll look at this impact on cheaper items recently and how that affects families. But first, I want to show you takeaway inflation. The worst example of this is fish and chips, which has seen the biggest jump in price of any of the takeaways at 52.47%. What was once a cheap way to feed a family now feels like a luxury, and it's likely the cost of oil, staff, and fish going up, because it isn't the potatoes. These are one of only 16 items in the basket of goods that the ONS used to calculate inflation that have decreased in price over the period that we looked at. Remember that this basket of goods is the way the ONS compiles the official figures. They monitor the price changes of a range of goods and services in this basket of goods to compile the overall figure. And this is what the ONS say about their basket of goods. The items in the baskets change so that the measures are up to date and representative of consumer spending patterns. The ONS has 744 items in its basket. Below is a link to everything that's included in one of these baskets, but let me just pick out a few for you here. Small pets, like hamsters, water sports equipment like windsurfing equipment, Eurotunnel fares, various ferry and sea fares, DVD/Blu-ray disc players, hire of domestic carpet and shampoo cleaners, marriage licenses, and costs of a basic cremation. They recently removed bag salads but kept DVD players. Now I know there's going to be people in the comments with Blu-ray Criterion collections telling me that physical media is growing in popularity, but surely we consume more salad leaves than we do DVDs. The basket of goods tries to capture the cost of things a person might buy, but really it's a list of basically everything you might ever buy, even stuff that you might buy once in your life or never. It's just not reflective of day-to-day life. The cost of a cremation and DVDs could fall, but you're not going to sit there going, well, that's brilliant, that's going to really help me out this month. I think this is why the inflation numbers and the headline rate feel so far away from what we feel on the ground. Also, the inflation rate per household can feel very different depending on where you sit on the income distribution. The IFS put together this paper that looked at this trend, and it's being referred to as cheapflation. Cheaper items increase in price at a higher percentage rate than more expensive versions. So cheap and cheerful, mostly air chicken Kievs go up in price as a percentage a lot quicker than, say, Tesco's Finest versions. So that means households that are on the wealthier end of the distribution who tend to buy, more expensive versions of the same goods tend to see a smaller percentage rate of inflation as a household than someone at the other end. Those in the higher deciles have seen a rate of inflation that is 7.7% lower than those in the bottom decile or those with the smaller household budgets. This is a form of inflation inequality, and it speaks to the fact that the headline rates we discuss, I'm guilty of this, are just not a reflection again of what is happening in your day-to-day life. So how do you work out your personal rate? It's not easy, but the ONS have put together a tool, both a simple version and a more in-depth version linked below, that you can use to work out what your rate looks like. I'd encourage you to go through it and have a go. Obviously, if you think the figures are accurate, it's up to you. But coming back to that pay thing earlier, it's that sort of information that I would want to be armed with before entering into a pay negotiation, as I just think it gives you a figure in mind. All eyes now turn to the budget at the end of the month, which promises to be one of the most eventful budgets of recent years. I'll be covering the budget on the day for my initial thoughts. I've also managed to convince Claire Barrett from the Financial Times and Paul Johnson, the director of the IFS, to agree to do a live session with us on the Friday after the budget. Think of it as like our own little version of question time, but instead of the lovely Fiona Bruce, you got a northerner who enjoys a Kiev. I'll ask you to submit questions regarding the budget in my video where I cover my thoughts initially, and then I'll be able to pose those directly to some of what I consider the most in-the-know and influential voices in the UK. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you will join. I'm now off to go and make a fried onion and mushroom chicken Kiev sandwich. Don't knock it till you tried it. The trick is cheap Kiev, good bread, sourdough, ciabatta, something like that. Bit of mayonnaise. Don't be scared to cook your mushrooms on a high heat also, they can take it.